Hi, Mage fans. This is your host, Terry Robinson with Mage the Podcast, and this episode consists of 4 interviews I did with creators who are doing interesting things in the Mage the Ascension community. The first is a conversation with Thrice Great about the Liberation MUSH, which is an online text-based persistent mage game you can go join right now. The next is with author Charles Siegel on his recent work bringing Sorcerer into M20 and compiling all existing paths into one book, as well as an additional supplement he wrote on Awakened Mathematics, and that interview starts at about the 19-minute mark. Third is a interview with T.L. Webb, Mage the Ascension fiction author who wrote a piece of society ether fiction continuing their stories of Texas, which starts at about the 48-minute mark. Finally, I talk with Robbie Susan, the Hermetic Hipster of the Hermetic Hipster YouTube channel, about their explainer work and recent supplement adding a lot of backgrounds for the traditions, which starts at around the 55-minute mark. As a note, my own publication, Strange Yesterdays, my book of alternative metaplot for Revised, is now on the Storyteller Vault for $4.99 for about 43 pages or 22,000 words. If you're a master or higher level supporter of Mage the Podcast, please check Patreon for your courtesy download link. Strange Yesterdays answers such questions as, what happens when you eat an antediluvian? What if the youth Anatoi were at war with the Hakacha? What if the return of the Fallen from Demon the Fallen is what destroyed Stygia instead of the 6th Great Maelstrom? As well as things like alternative mechanics for the Avatar Storm. Links to everything mentioned is in the show notes. And with that, on with the show. Hi, Mage fans. This is your host, Terry Robinson, and my guest right now is going by the nom de internet of Thrice Great. Thrice Great, how you doing?
I'm great. I'm so happy to be on Mage the Podcast. I'm a longtime listener, and I'm just really excited to be here.
Gladly. And the project you are informing us about is the Liberation MUSH. What is a mush?
That's a good question. The Wikipedia article on it is a great place to get more information. But I think of a mush, it stands for like multi-user hallucination, or you might hear MUD, which is like multi-user dungeon. They date back to sort of the very early days of online gaming. So they're a little bit of a throwback. They're a little bit of a little bit retro. I think the easiest way to explain what a mush is to people who haven't mushed is that it's a novel form of a LARP. So imagine a LARP as a novel, then you get a mush.
Okay, so when I think LARP, I think things as being real-time, de minimis systems, often more collaborative than a traditional table game, much more invested in personification and investment in a character, maybe more so than traditional notions of plot. So is this done real time? Or I guess if one is participating, what is the literal interface one uses?
Yeah, it's all of those things. The one thing I would add is that it's a persistent world. So if anybody is familiar with World of Warcraft, right, you can log in and you can chat with your buddies or go into a dungeon or something like that. Well, we don't have like dungeons or any of sort of that automated content. The world is persistent. So you can log in at any point and there will be somebody else also playing a character who you can RP with. So you can have, you know, your syndicate magic person interacting, you know, cutting some sort of deal with a Sedite fixer in a backroom bar. That, you know, that's a possibility. In the middle of the night somewhere, and one could be in Antarctica and the other person could be in China. The way that people interact with the game itself is they log into it. So use what's known as a Mush client. There are a couple of different versions of that. The one I use is Atlantis, that's for Mac, but there's a bunch for Windows. One's called Potato, one is called Mush Client. There are a number of them that you can use, and you put your character name in and you put your password and hit enter and you come into the world.
So this is real time then. So it sounds like there is no way for me to wave my hands and have 4 months pass, as will often happen at a table game. What is the conflict resolution system? So one character wants to see something happen in the world, another character wants to see something happen in the world. They disagree on what the outcome would be, or there is some other test or challenge. How is that resolved?
Oh, what a great question. Very carefully. In-game, gamers will be familiar with this term PvP, so it's player versus player. And that could range from anything from soft intrigue, like I have going on right currently now between the Syndicate and the Order of Hermes, where they're sort of jockeying for a particular prize, to life or death combats, where people are rolling their decks or in initiatives and fighting each other. So So usually it's through a series of roles and what's known as poses, which means you're sort of describing what you're doing. And those are compared to one another. And whoever the dice favor is the winner of that contest. But there are other things that go along with it. Obviously, the role playing flavors the dice. So it's typical White Wolf fashion. It's not just dice, not just role playing, a little bit of both.
Okay, so we've discussed kind of the base system. So it sounds like you're using X20 of some sort. You're using a standard character sheet, or
Yeah, we have all of the 20 lines. So we've got Vampire through Changeling, all of the 20th anniversary. So you can log in and play any of those.
that brings up a couple of other things. There are players for this. Is this something for which you are recruiting, or is this, for instance, something where you have a cast and the world gets to watch the story or novel they create? How does the audience, or how does an audience, specifically our listeners, get to interface or participate with this project?
So all they would have to do, they can find out more at liberationmush.site. So liberationmush.site, and they can find out a little bit more of the setting. Our mush is a little different than other mushes in that it's a hybrid. There's a little more, I guess, tabletop elements involved in this. So I'm what's known as the Mage director.
Okay.
So I'm in charge of the Mage metaplot, and it takes place in Los Angeles. So I've built a bunch of NPC chantries and NPCs, and I've created an in-world history. And where the players come in is they're able to come in and they can make just about any flavor of Mage they want to. And they work with me as sort of in a storyteller capacity to make sure that the sheet works, that it's not too overpowered, and that it's going to be a good fit, and that there are links into the existing Mage society. So it's very, very collaborative, more similar to a tabletop game as opposed to some other mushes where you can just log in and kind of create a character and figure it out from there.
One way I like to consider a game is kind of in the notion of what is sometimes known in GNS as stance theory. The portion of the domain of the game that is controlled by a player dedicated to this being the setting, traditionally referred to as the storyteller or GM, and how much the players have control over things. Are these players joining an established world where you've already figured out the movers and shakers, or is this something where I get to participate and I say, I think it would be super interesting if this NPC or this element of the world changed in this way over time? I guess you could say, what degree of collaboration occurs once character creation is done?
The way that I would describe it, at least the way that I run things, is that it's pretty much a 50-50 collaboration. We have different roles, and
Mm-hmm.
this is how I run things tabletop as well. My role is to create the context, environment, the NPCs. Their role is to come up against those and be in conflict with those. So, going back to the Hollywood metaphor, I'm the director, the players are the stars. As far as how much control they've got out of it, they've got a lot of control. The way that I built the Mage sphere or the Mage game is that there's this existing history of mages in Los Angeles, and all of that was shaken up by what's known in our world as the Storm. It's basically the Avatar Storm. It's a slightly different version of that, as well as the technocratic pogroms. So at the end of the 20th century, the technocracy is like, we've won, so it's murder time, right? So we're all familiar with some version of this meta plot. So things have been shaken up, and we're missing certain masters, and we're missing certain power players. So now the players are allowed to come in and fill that vacuum. And they can do that in a bunch of ways, through direct action, through their spheres, through our influence system, which is a mechanical means of influencing the environment, or through their own actions and through the stories that they tell with me or with each other.
Why Los Angeles? When is it set? Can you give us some information about the setting and its goings on?
Yeah, so Los Angeles, because our head sort of wizard or the leader of the mush and the founder, who goes by the name Sundance on our mush, she lives in Los Angeles. It's a city that she knows very, very well. Whenever I have questions, I come on the director channel and I'm like, hey, is this hotel's there? Or what's this like now? And she pretty much knows all of the answers. Los Angeles is a city that has so many faces and so many different kinds of people. Literally every kind of human, I think, in the world exists in Los Angeles. So the player character possibilities are endless there. It's this giant metropolis. It's such a weird city. It's really a great setting for a World of Darkness game. The other piece, what's our Los Angeles like? It takes place in modern day, but we're like a pre-gentrification Los Angeles. So it's more of the gritty Los Angeles of the 80s and 90s. Everything is a little bit darker, a little grittier, a little worse, a little more corrupt, a little more neo-noir.
Okay, so neon. The way I like to put the neo noir genre is it's the '90s, except for generally without as much homophobia, and generally we got rid of shoulder pads. Pastels are still in. That is kind of my ideal version of things. So how do you keep track of this? I mean, Los Angeles is a city, the second largest city in the United States, in the millions, depending on how liberal one wishes to be with the definition of the city limits. You mentioned you are the director. This world is persistent. How the heck do you keep track of everything?
It gets hectic. We use a job system, so people submit. If anybody's done any customer support, it's basically like a task system. Only it's run on our Mush server, which hosts all the soft code. So it handles all of the dice and other things like being able to talk either privately or publicly, stuff like that. So we use a job system. And so a lot of things are handled via the job. That's how I keep track of my mages. But I also chat with them about what's going on with them. And I'm running weekly, sort of the equivalent of a tabletop game. I run about 2 of those a week, one for the tradition side, one for the technocracy. So I keep track with folks that way. And I'm pretty friendly, and I like to pretend like I'm an NPC from a Dragon Quest game. So I tell people, may the light shine upon thee. So I feel like I'm pretty approachable. I hope I am. I hope players feel like they can come and talk to me about their experience of the game or what's going on or what they'd like to do.
So for someone who is interested in kind of getting a taste for the world and how it's going on, is there a way to watch, or is there a way to get an idea of kind of what the tenor of the game is?
There's no way to really watch. You would have to log into the server to get access to that. But there may be logs posted. There's a player wiki, which there may be logs posted there, so people can go and check that out to see if any logs of so basically it's the written equivalent of an actual play, so you can kind of see how people do this and what they're getting up to, see if it might be for you. You can also see the various players, the player characters pages, and how they set them up and what kinds of folks inhabit our little pocket universe, Los Angeles.
And you flip through a couple of those, you browse during a lunch break or something like that, or you dick around while you're on the bus on the phone, and that kind of gives you an idea of what the tenor of the game is.
Sure, absolutely.
If all the character art just shows people with very large swords, you're like, that just tells you a lot about that tells you a lot about the game. And when I go to category characters on your wiki, there are 303 in total. This is not a small world. Why are you doing this to yourself?
Luckily, there aren't 303 mages. I got into mushing sort of in the late 1990s, early 2000s. I started off on a somewhat infamous game within the mush community called Dark Metal, which is this hybrid of Cyberpunk 2020 and World of Darkness. It was a very, very early second edition game. But it was kind of infamous because it was like Cyberpunk. It was pretty deadly at the time. But if you guys aren't familiar with the World of Future Darkness that came out in White Wolf magazine, I think. Are you familiar with that, Terry?
I'm familiar with the idea of it, and it answers critical questions like, how does the Curse of Cain work when you're in space? And other such things.
There was actually a discipline called Techne, which allowed you to integrate cyber. It's pretty bananas stuff, but it was inspired by that. And that was how I got my start. And then I've played on various games like Metro. That was another big one. And now Liberation, when I logged in, they were looking for a Mage director. And I said, I've run a ton of Mage over the years. I've been playing Mage since first edition. I was prepared to run Mage.
And for anyone who's not interested in the game directly, one thing I have generally found that mushes and large collaborative games like this do, especially for new players and storytellers, is it gives you kind of an integrated view of how a world can work. You don't need this degree of specificity, but for instance, your setup is pretty thorough on how chantry creation works. Guideline and recommendations for character creation all of the traditions, you give detailed information about their subfactions, which is something we haven't had since Revised, except for little bits there. And it's all in one place, and it's free, and it's open to the public. And you and your group have lovingly entered it in. It doesn't look like it's just like Vathsways from tradition books that have been copy and pasted in. So even if someone is not necessarily interested in the game directly, we can all benefit from the work you and your team have put into making a world come alive. Of the resources you have put together, or of the bits that you have as part of your public facing stuff, is there anything you're particularly proud of, or that you think reflects a particularly high standard of work the Liberation team has done?
Two things: the convention and tradition write-ups. I put a lot of work into those. I really took a look at both editions of the convention or the tradition, and took the best pieces, and then built a little breezeway out from Revised, and said, this is where we were in Revised, more or less. What would be the next hop? I wasn't looking to do game design or rewrite a tradition or a convention, but I was looking to sort of update it for the 21st century, for the M20 setting books. The other piece, particularly happy with how the NPC chantries came out. There's a tendency within the Mush community to put the traditions all into one big chantry, and that just doesn't make any sense to me at all. I think that chantries generally are either sort of ancestral chantries, where they're like, we're the Order of Hermes chantry and we're just going to do Order of Hermes stuff. That's all we're interested in. But the way that it was presented to me, particularly in second edition and in Fallen Tower Las Vegas, which are kind of our only examples of cabals. We've got a couple of others, but we don't have a ton of setting books of like by night books like Vampire does, where we get lots of examples of coterie. So to me, it made sense that the traditions would be really fractured, and that they'd be all operating with competing or sometimes parallel or agendas, and they would be organized in mixed cabals around particular affinities or ideas. So I wanted the players, when they came in, to find NPC chantries where they could hook into. So if they're technomancers, there's a couple of technomancer chantries that they could potentially join. Or if they're mystics, there's that. If you want to do scholarship, they've got another version of that. The other piece is that I really took a look at Los Angeles and said, what's Los Angeles history? And where would the mages be? Like who would have the mages been? So we've got this one chantry that's mixed, but was started by the Order of Hermes. It's called Ascension Lodge, and it has this like wonderful mission with this very checkered history. And I based that off of a real Ordo Templi Orientis, or OTO, body that existed there called Agape Lodge, which also had an interestingly checkered history, where it had both Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard, and there was some like wife stealing and all kinds of funny wizardly intrigue. So I took that, and I had the original founders of Ascension Lodge be an Etherite and a couple of Order of Hermes, and the Etherite was based off Howard Hughes. And so he's this like fabulous womanizing innovator who gets chased around by the Void Engineers and his prototype ships, but he steals a node during a poker game between him and the Order of Hermes. And so the Order of Hermes is real bitter about that. And the Etherites are like, what? We won fair and square. So there's lots of great context, but these are also old grudges. So they're stuff that the players can kind of unearth and choose to engage with again, and get pulled into these masters' petty squabbles, or they can resolve them, or they can ignore them and chart their own path. But I really wanted to tie it into the Los Angeles history. So it's not just like these Order of Hermes doing this thing here. No, these things are sort of fictions based off of actual Los Angelinos.
So again, it sounds like you've created a wonderful, rich world that people will have the opportunity to engage in. If people are interested in starting to play, where again should they be going?
They can go to Liberation MUSH. That's Liberation MUSCH .site, SITE. I'm sure you'll get that in the show notes.
That will very much be in the show notes. And if people are on our Discord and they would like to reach out to you with questions, is there a way that they can do that? If you'd prefer to have that be a no, that's fine too.
Yeah, they're welcome to ask me some questions. On Discord, I go by Harco, HARCO. If you're an Ars Magica fan, maybe you know what that's from.
Do you speak Ars Magica fluently?
Fairly fluently, yeah. I actually played Ars Magica before I even played Mage Ascension.
I hope to one day crack that open. But in the meantime, Thrice Great, thank you so much for your time.
Harry, It's been such a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Gladly. Let's all mage. Our next guest today and our roundup of Mage the Ascension community products is friend of the show and frequent guest Charles Siegel. Charles, prolific Storyteller Vault author, has produced 2 new supplements, both of which I think have something to offer to your table, depending on what kind of table you have. The first project is Sorcerer Paths of Power, which attempts to update sorcerer rules to the standards of M20 and kind of synchronize and harmonize a whole bunch of rules. Charles, why do you think M20 needed a new set of sorcerer rules?
M20 has a sort of its fundamental ethos that everything is about focus. Like which tradition or faction or whatever doesn't determine much about the character directly, but their practices, for instance, are very important to them. The previous editions of Sorcerer both had every single path depending on a specific dice pool. The most classic example is that Hellfire, which has nothing to do with hell, but a lot to do with fire, was an occult roll. And then they had to put in a quick, well, if you're making a technocratic sorcerer, maybe make it a science roll. And it was just very rigid and really only modeled sorcerers for very specific groups instead of having hedge magicians of various sorts fitting into every group, which Revised, including in Sorcerer Revised, tried to suggest was the norm. It always felt kind of awkward trying to model extraordinary citizens or just some of the stranger practitioners out there this way.
Yeah, no matter how you were doing Hellfire, what trappings you put around it, rolling manipulation plus occult didn't always seem entirely appropriate. Yeah. So M20 kind of went back to 2E and suggested that sorcerers and mages weren't that tight. So what does this book do then to give you more, I guess you could say, sorceress practices or sorceress paradigms?
Aside from talking about how sorcerers fit into each of the traditions, conventions, and crafts, going through the tradition books, convention books, book of crafts, and just thinking through how it would work, collect a bunch of sorcery groups from across the editions, including some that were not really mentioned much in the sorcerer books. Like the Arcanum never really got much space in a sorcerer book, but they had the most detailed section on the path of alchemy in any book published. One of my favorite sorcery groups, the Enlightened Society of the Weeping Moon, which is just a great name, is from Werewolf the Wild West. And specifically, they were wiped out in the Wild West time period. So I came up with a way to bring their practices back.
What's their shtick?
The original group are basically a bunch of rich religious cultists who had gotten their hands on some partial Black Spiral Dancer documents and misinterpreted them, mostly building this religion around the goddess called the Weeping Moon, who would crash down to Earth and destroy their enemies one day. The modern incarnation that I wrote up involved a bunch of teenagers LARPing lycanthropy, the Rapture in Texas, near where the original society had been and had done things. And they happened to find partial books from the original Enlightened Society, and they're slowly learning how these things work. They're sort of now a sorcery organization in its infancy, but also with ties to an older organization and just figuring things out as they go.
Are there any other groups outside of those we got in World of Darkness Sorcerer and Sorcerer Revised that you kind of update or include information on that people who are only familiar maybe with Mage books would be seeing for the first time?
I don't believe that Mage actually ever wrote anything up about the Society of Leopold, the Inquisition, or Strike Force Zero, which kind of got their own book. Like they're from Demon Hunter X. They're both hunter organizations. They interact the most with vampire, but they're not exactly friends of wizards. The Society of Leopold is built around true faith more than sorcery, but they do have some paths, a kind of mix of psychic powers and sorcerer's paths, actually. Their version of fire is not based on hellfire, it's pyrokinesis, which is a bit more burny, let's say.
Speaking of pyrokinesis, do you include both psychic noumena and sorcerer's paths? Okay.
Yeah, it's titled Sorcerer because we've had 2 books of Sorcerer already. It's an attempt to cover hedge magic as completely as possible in one place, which is another thing that hadn't really happened. Like even Sorcerer Revised, which was fairly comprehensive, did leave out a bunch of paths that had appeared in werewolf books or things used by hunters in vampire books and so on. For instance, the path of, and this is a Numina path, not a psychic power, but the path of spirit chasing is very much from werewolf. It did not appear in either Sorcerer or Sorcerer Revised, and it was intended for kinfolk, but putting it into one place so that there's one reference for all of this hedge magic stuff was an important design consideration.
And this is a big book. So outside of updating some of the groups and providing unified mechanical systems, is there anything else that the book offers?
I included a bit of a storytelling chapter. It's kind of a quick overview. I didn't feel a need to rehash everything a million times. And you've used the description that mages are kind of the liminal characters of the world of darkness. They're the Spider-Man of the world of darkness. They get in everything. Sorcerers are even more that than mages. They have their own things going on. They very naturally fit into mage just as sort of the secondary version of mages, the ones that fill out the ranks if you have a game where mages are rare but you want the traditions to matter, then the sorcerers are a key way to do that. There's only a couple hundred actual hermetics in the world. It doesn't really make sense to have like a dozen houses. If you have a couple hundred hermetic mages and then a few thousand sorcerers, the houses start working again, and they start being useful. So it's a way to get intra-tradition politics without having to have a lot of mages if that's what you want in your game. Sorcerers summon things, which means that they interact with wraith. The kinfolk sorcerers are explicitly in the kinfolk book for werewolf. Anyone can be a ghoul, and even if you're using the blood treachery rules that make being a ghoul really brutal for a mage, sorcerers don't have that problem. And sorcerers are fairly good candidates to be embraced by the Tremere or any other clan that likes having blood magic. Changelings are, as they often are, a bit more difficult to play with because of things like the mists. But a changeling running into a sorcerer with the path of Oneromancy has suddenly got an out-of-context problem in the dreaming. Is not really what they're used to seeing there. Like the dreaming is, maybe it's not their turf in the same way that like a Horizon Realm is mage turf, but it's something they're supposed to have some idea of what can happen with it. And having just some random mortal who, as far as they can tell, is completely mundane, except for they can just show up in the dreaming, it gives all sorts of interesting story ideas and routes to crossover. Though one of my personal big uses of sorcerers is honestly probably the least interesting use of them overall, which is mages with training wheels.
What does that mean?
Spheres are hard, especially for new players, and especially if you're introducing the game to younger players. The genesis of this book was that I was visiting some friends, and their oldest kids wanted to they were used to playing Dungeons and Dragons and whatnot as a family, and they wanted to play too. But the friends wanted me to run Mage because they hadn't played Mage in a long time, and they consider me a good storyteller for some reason. So I figured a story set before second edition, basically, back when the Force Collegius existed, have the adults playing teachers and the kids playing students at the Force Collegius. It creates a nice natural setup. Drop the kids into a situation where they had an idea of what's going on. They're in a magic school. It also was a corner of the world of darkness where you could do things, but also it wasn't going to get so dark that it'd be inappropriate for the people involved. Yeah, we ended up having a good time with it, but it turned out to be harder than expected because Sorcerer Revised and M20 are close to compatible, but not quite compatible. Because everyone's hermetic, it was kind of by the book, like these dice pools are going to be fine for you. Like manipulation plus occult is a perfectly reasonable dice pool for Hellfire for hermetic. So out of the frustration from that game being more difficult to run than I thought it should have been, that's when I started updating Sorcerer for M20. I got a lovely character sheet made for me by Mr. Gahan.
Oh, nice. So we get an updated Sorcerer character sheet for M20.
Yep. And it's in there. There's lots of fun stuff. Another section that's probably worth thinking about is what happens when if a sorcerer awakens. Where does all the XP they spent on paths go? I tend to be in the XP expenditures are fairly sacred camp of storytellers, but also one of the themes that Order of Hermes Revised hits on Sorcerer's Awakening is that they are giving up a power for enlightenment. So you're giving up something to get that first out of Arete. And so you might not be able to throw fireballs, like you used to be able to, but you still know the symbolic resonances of the Pentacle of Mars. So I converted old paths into XP breaks on spheres.
And so ultimately, did you keep the aspect system from Revised or do something else?
By and large, I kept the aspect system. I have always been a splitting successes into various parts of effects in Mage person. So I just stuck with that for sorcery. And I covered every type of static magic I could find. So I've got a section on hedge magic, one on psychic powers or psychic phenomena, a short section on true faith, and a longer section on infernalism, which actually does draw a bunch of infernal paths from vampire books.
Oh, neat. The other project you have, which warmed my heart, is Paradigms Explored Number and Shape. This is an installment that basically says, here is a paradigm practice and set of instruments, and I'm going to explain it to you. What is the paradigm being explored?
So I was inspired by your work with Josh Heath in Paradigm Explored Weird and Weft, was it?
Yep.
Which was a detailed Norse magic practitioner. And I will admit that so a lot of my projects tend to either come from, this will be useful at my table, or this is a thing that annoyed me, and so I'm going to fix it. And the thing that annoyed me is the word in, I believe it was the original Guide to the Technocracy, hypermathematics. Like hypertech, I understand what it is. It's technology that is far beyond anything that we can actually build. But math isn't like technology in that same way. Like if you have a proof, you have a proof. I had conversations with several people about what hypermathematics could possibly mean, and decided I'm just going to come up with a character who does hypermathematics in some sense and just try to make sense of that as a concept. So my background is, I'm trained as a mathematician. So specifically, it was annoying to me for that reason.
So what did you ultimately decide hypermathematics was, or alternatively, what it wasn't?
So what it isn't is just math far beyond any math that has been used or published or whatnot. That's just more math. I tried to think through what would be possible with mathematics that requires the tools that mages have that sleepers don't. And one of the key things is that mages are able to think about things that sleepers can't conceive of. The spheres themselves are something that a sleeper in the world of darkness can have a kind of vague notion of. If you explain them, I guess, they can't learn even the first dot of a sphere. So there's some cognitive capability that mages have that sleepers don't, based on that and a few other things. I figured mathematics that has to do with objects that mages can think about, but sleepers can't. And the big example in my head, which just made a lot of things really fit together for some cool example effects and so on, was in mathematics, there's this thing called the axiom of choice. There's many versions of it, and it's a famous joke about it is that the axiom of choice is obviously true. The well-ordering principle is obviously false, and who knows about Zorn's lemma, but they're all the same state. They're all the same thing. The simplest example of it is if you have any collection of sets of objects, you can pick one from each without a problem. Like this feels intuitively true, and it is very much true if you have finite sets of objects and a finite number of them. But when everything starts getting infinite, it starts getting hard. If you have an infinite set of pairs of shoes, you can always pick the left shoe. But how do you give a rule for picking a sock from infinitely many pairs of socks? And that's a very artificial, simple example, but you can do some very strange things with it. One of which is actually the very first example wrote in this book, which I'll jump to if you don't mind.
To Banach-Tarski.
Yeah, so the Banach-Tarski paradox is probably one of the most famous mathematical sleights of hand out there, where you take a solid ball, you cut it into 5 pieces, you move the pieces around, and now you have 2 solid balls the same size. It duplicates the ball perfectly. It's actually much worse than that. It's if you have any solid object in space and any other solid object in space, you can make finitely many, you can take one, break it into finitely many subsets, and rearrange them into the other. And it doesn't need to be connected or anything. That's how you can go from 1 ball to 2 balls.
Yeah, it is not like you're taking a knife and making
what
we would consider to be a simple cut. Yeah.
That is where the sleight of hand is. People say cut, but really it's these amorphous clouds of points that are infinitely complex and intricate, and that provably you can't write them down because you need to use the axiom of choice in a very strong way to find them. But if a mage can just use the axiom of choice and find them, then a mage who uses mathematics as one of their practices would be able to just duplicate things directly. And so it's a prime 2 matter 3 effect in general to just take an object and duplicate it. Matter 2 plus, actually, generally. It's a really useful thing. It is all sorts of vulgar. If you want to get paradox, do it by doing math.
The other thing that I like about it is on page 7, it mentions faction. And one of the things that always frustrated me is people would come up with a character concept and they say, my character uses herbs or something like that. What tradition should they be in? They're like, oh, obviously they're verbena. I'm like, I don't know. I mean, to me, Dreamspeaker, Society of Ether, Celestial Chorus, Order of Hermes, like...
Just give me an instrument and I can tell you how any group could use it. It's how you use it and in what context.
So you have a detailed faction section. Where do you feel this kind of mathematics fits into the factions of Mage?
So I think that it can fit into most of them. Like, it's a little bit trickier with some of the more primal factions, like the Verbena or the Dreamspeakers, because mathematics is a very intellectual undertaking. So if you have any kind of intellectual faction, though, you can fit it in, some better than others. Like, it's not the easiest fit for the Akashayana, though they are a very intellectual faction in some forms. But I listed how to make this guy a chorister, a hermetic, and a virtual adept, but could also easily be an Etherite. And it'd take a little bit more work to make him some of the more mystical groups. Then in the Technocracy, Iteration X, the Syndicate, and the Void Engineers are all natural fits for a mathematician. The Progenitors and the New World Order a bit less. The Progenitors tend to be a lot more experimental. They're much more experimentalist and much lighter on theory compared to Iteration X. And the New World Order tends to be the humanities. The one that I got a couple of people messaging me with, how did you make that work, was the Hollow Ones.
So how did you make that work?
Well, you have to keep in mind that the Hollow Ones have been influenced by mathematicians from the start. It'd be weird to have the Hollow Ones not have anything to say about, for instance, Alice in Wonderland. And Lewis Carroll was the pen name of Charles Dodgson, who was himself a mathematician there's an apocryphal anecdote that Queen Victoria had so liked Alice in Wonderland that she asked him to send her a copy of his next book. And then she received a copy of A Treatise on Determinants and was quite disappointed. Mathematics was very romantic at the time, too.
So one of the things that you do in here is, rather than just giving this kind of vague notion of paradigm, you kind of break it down into what you call axiomata. What is an axiomata, and what are the axiomata of this paradigm?
The paradigms, as listed in M20 and several other books now, are very, very abbreviated, broad statements. They don't actually tell you how any individual thinks of how magic works. To me, instead, a set of axiomata or tenet, they're very similar to the tenets that you put into Weird and Weft. I felt axiom was a better word, especially talking about math. And that's like a first thing that tells you what kind of character you're looking at or playing. But it's sort of a set of statements about the world that in total explain how magic can possibly exist and how you are capable of doing it, whether that magic is science, faith, or more traditional occult mysticism. For this character, the very first axiom is all is number. Dates back to Pythagoras. Did the Mage revised thing where everything dates back to ancient Greece. There's also little bits of apocryphal math history that I wrote in, like the Pythagoreans murdering someone for proving that the square root of 2 is irrational. A response to vulgar magic, if I've ever seen one, because at the time people couldn't conceive of irrational numbers. But generally, it's the idea that everything is described by numbers, and the numbers that describe things are equal to the things in some sense. The second one is pure forms exist and can be accessed. So this is a belief in the existence of the Platonic realm. So pure forms are just perfect instantiations of things. Like in the real world, you can have 3 pillows, you can have 3 grains of rice, you can have 3 bears, but you can't have 3. Like the number 3 as a thing abstractly apart from any instantiation. That's what's in the Platonic realm. That's what a pure form looks like. Similarly, an actual perfect circle. These are not things that actually exist in the physical world. There's always error. There's always movement. Things are not stable. In this belief system, they exist somewhere, and that somewhere is, it happens, a place in the high umber that you can just go to. The next one is shape is an instantiated number. That knowing that everything is a number, and that for lack of anything else that you can stick there, numbers exist in and of themselves is well and good, but you need some way to actually bring it down to to something a bit more concrete so that you can actually work magic. Even though they still exist in the Platonic realm, shapes and numbers are intricately connected. There's simple things like the length of a line segment or the number of sides of a polygon or whatever. And then there's more complicated things that you can get into with esoteric modern mathematics. And then the fourth axiom really brings it all together for how to affect change in the world, which is the shape of a thing determines its nature. An example of this out in actually historical theories of physics, it was believed in it was suggested, I shouldn't say believed because it was not a strongly held belief by anyone. In the 19th century, before the Michelson-Morley experiment disproved ether, so again, anytime you mention ether, you're tying it very clearly to a mage faction. It was believed that atoms were vortices in the ether. Just the ether is like a fluid, it can flow and it can have all sorts of shapes. And the shape of these vortices are essentially knots, and different knots corresponded to different chemical elements. If you add that specific version of this, then suddenly, say, transmuting lead into gold is a matter of just taking a knot, untying it, and tying it in a different way. This axiom really brings the more abstract, how the universe functions and is built stuff down to what are you doing on the ground and connects to practices.
And also kind of answers the question of where does magic come from? Where does the act of magic come from?
Yeah, it is reshaping something.
Mm-hmm. You go into the Platonic realm. Is there a interesting location or a taste of that you'd like to share?
A thing in here that I'm particularly proud of. I've been looking for a place to write up binary search dryads for about 2 years. So binary search dryads come from a region of the Platonic realm called the digital borderlands, which it is a connection to the digital web. Basically, it's an area where computer science and mathematics interface. And there's a structure in computer science called a binary search tree, which is, the details aren't super important. It's a tree, which has a mathematical definition, and it's a way of organizing information so that you can find it very, very quickly. I have been having for a long time characters who are trying to find things on the digital web running into binary search dryads. So dryads are Greek tree spirits. And I figured here's a little bit of mysticism updated to the internet age. If there are trees that contain information, then you should encounter them as information spirits in some way, and they should be dryads. Yeah, as I said, very helpful for finding things, and most of what they're going to want in exchange is information that they have not indexed yet. It's not actually how search engines work, but you could easily use sort of a super giant binary search dryad to represent a spirit like a certain internet search engine that dominates all searches today.
Lycos, got it. And this, to me, answers an interesting question of, in the same way that Revise posited that every group had a technomantic and a shamanic group within it, it is high time that we get to see how every paradigm interfaces with the now ubiquitous digital web, and positing the existence of semi-technological seeming creatures and how those, for lack of a better term, paradigms syncretize, as it were, or what the smashing together of those paradigms looks like, I think is something that certainly helps the game along. Additionally, when I think Charles Siegel, I think of wonders. Do you include any wonders or magic items?
I have 3. There's Hagamoro Chalk, which is a real thing. The original version of the real version has been discontinued, and it was picked up. It's being made again, but by and large, the reaction has been it's not the same. But it was this really fancy chalk made in one factory in Japan that was designed specifically not to get chalk dust on your hands while you used it. So math departments around the world would have a box or two that they kept for eminent speakers who came to visit and so on. And there's an urban legend among mathematicians that if you're using Hagamoro chalk, you can't write down an incorrect theorem. I made a variant of the Ring of Truth effect for entropy. If you attempt to write down a false statement, and in this case, it's higher entropy, so you don't even need to know that it's false. It just needs to be provably false. Then it will come out smudged. You cannot write down a statement that you could prove is false with this. And also they provide paradox cancellation, because I've compared paradox to incorrect proofs in other places here. And then, of course, there's the very much not concise hypermathematics, a concise introduction. 681 pages was not picked at random. Care to guess where I got that number?
I assume that's the number of pages of the M20 core. Alternatively, Road to Reality would be the closest one I could think of, and that one's, I think, a bit chunkier than that.
Yeah, so M20 actually is about 14 pages longer than that, which mostly means that I put the wrong number in.
Oh, okay.
A little bit of a poke at M20 for being very much not concise, which was never its purpose. My favorite are the books that start an introduction to X, and then the first chapter, they assume that you've read 2 other books on that topic. This is just a constant thing. So I made that into a grimoire / a primer, where if you can understand this book, you're doing hypermathematics now. You're awake.
So this is available on the Storyteller Vault. It clocks in at a whopping $3, and it gives you everything you need to have a hypermathematics character in there. As someone who's produced a lot of different types of Storyteller Vault supplements, how did you feel about producing a paradigm introduction?
I enjoyed it. It really highlighted to me, trying to write this down in this much detail, ways in which I am unsatisfied with the system, with the focus system as written in M20. In any case, I still largely kept to it. The axioms are not even my innovation. They were yours and Josh's. Definitely a part of this process ended up being pushing me to work more on a project of mine that involving fleshing out the focus rules. And I probably am not going to do a second one of these anytime soon. But I also don't regret doing it, especially because writing up the Platonic realm in that much detail was fun. Also, weird, fun places in the High Umbra, that represent things that people have actually believed existed in history, are actually a little bit thinner on the ground. Like, no one in history has really believed in the Fortress of Government. The Platonic realm is up there in the same way that the Akashic Record is up there. It's a thing that people have believed in and also fits both thematically and mechanically into that space.
At least for me, it felt like a good project that you could bang out in about 2 weeks of spare time, something like that, depending on how much time you spend on templating. But
at least a first draft.
Something workable.
A couple of weeks on the first draft, and then that was terrible. I need to rewrite that completely. But
yeah. Hey, who knows? Maybe we get a book about the High Umbra or about Sorcerer for M20, and we no longer have to do this as part of the STV.
That'd be great. I mean, both of those would be kind of the third book in a series that already exists for other lines.
Yeah.
We've got Ghoul. We had that's another reason I did that Paths of Power. Ghouls have a book. Kinfolk have a book. The High Umbra, we've got Wraith and we've got W20 Umbra. It'd be great. We'll see what's coming down the pipeline. M20, at least as of the time of recording, still seems to have some legs to it.
Here's to hoping we get those books. Charles, as always, it's been great to talk to you. We will have links to both of these products in the show notes. Is there anything else that is out now that you would like to tell our listeners about?
So I've started a Patreon now that the rules on Dark Pack and Storyteller's Vault stuff have been clarified in a few ways. In addition to updating Enlightened Grimoire, my bestseller, I've also decided that I am going to do a short write-up for big corporation of some kind that is in some way aligned with each tradition.
Interesting.
So something that can be how your character gets to the resources 6 or so level that you need in order to use a lot of the stuff in Rich Bastard's Guide.
Oh, awesome. That sounds great. One
of the things werewolf players really love, at least, is just all the subsidiaries of Pentex and sticking them in the background. Like, your characters go out to get burgers at O'Tully's, or they play World of Shadows games or whatnot. I feel like the World of Darkness could use more fictional corporations. Maybe, to pick something that's not at all topical as of today, a social media company that's pushing to bring the digital web into reality.
I look forward to talking to you when and if that makes it into the world. Also, thank you so much for your time.
Right.
For our next segment, I am having a discussion with now distinguished, I dare say, Storyteller's Vault fiction author, TL Webb. TL, how you doing?
I am doing great. Had a great night out. We went trick-or-treating with the kid.
Nice. Any Mage-associated costuming on your behalf? Was there a mythic thread that maybe you tapped for this?
Oh, I dressed as Mario, the greatest of all plumbers.
I mean, I think for every 30 or 40 pieces of candy that you personally collect, I think that turns into a dram of Tass. I'm not quite sure how this quite works. But you have a release on the Storyteller's Vault that is kind of tied with Halloween. What is it?
Well, 2 releases, actually.
Two releases?
Getting ready. Yes. 3 stories. 2 of them are getting released today. One of them was already out. One of them had been out in a anthology called Darkened Streets, and that's a story called Fireball Run.
Okay.
And we're going to put that up as a pay what you want. I'm going to be doing that after our conversation right now, actually. And the other one is the third part in the now series, Darkness in Dallas, of which Fireball Run is the first. And that story is called Cyberfunk.
What's it about?
Well, the first story started the whole adventure when somebody attacked a car race the Society of Ether was having. And, well, they weren't entirely happy about that. When one of them went to investigate the grave of the attacker and they were assaulted by zombies and other horrible things, they think maybe there are shenanigans afoot. And now my character, Albert T. Edison, junkyard wizard extraordinaire, is heading off to cyberspace to talk to the guy who trained the person who attacked them.
You had the Fireball Run, which was part of, I think, the Darkened Street. And then is the second one Dead Reckoning?
Yes, it is. Dead Reckoning is the second.
And the third one is entitled Cyberfunk.
That is right.
Is it an anthology? Are they all stories that build off of each other? Or are they just in the same shared world? Or
all right. All of these are short stories. They are interconnected. They're going to be part of the series Darkness over Dallas.
And is this one of those things where if you haven't read the previous one, you can jump into this, or do you need to start from the beginning?
I am doing my darndest to make sure that each story is mostly self-contained with a running thread of stuff is going on.
How do you do that as an author?
It's not easy, but in each case, you have a character who has a goal. You don't always have to have that goal be starting at the beginning of the story. It can come before. You know, an investigation, you don't always start with the murder. That's already happened. Now you have to figure out who done it. And that can be a long story.
So tell us a little bit about the characters that are participating in this story.
We are following Albert, and Albert is... Have you ever seen Lonesome Dove?
I have not seen Lonesome Dove.
There's a character in Lonesome Dove named Gus, and Gus is kind of a talky jackass, but he's a lot of fun. He's also incredibly capable, and I would say he was a major inspiration for Albert. Albert wants to get stuff done. He's an engineer. He despises entropy around him and wants to beat it into submission. And he doesn't like that there's stuff going around messing with his friends and with his life and trying to kill them from occult dimensions. So he really wants to find out what's going on. His goal here is to visit a friend of his and borrow her VR rig. She is a virtual adept named Mother Mayday. And he's going to use that to go to the Mary Shelley Institute of Etheric Advancement, where the professor who trained their assailant is teaching. That's not going to go smooth at all. At all.
Good to know. So you said this is part of a series. Does this finish an arc, or is there a payoff at the end, or is this kind of a cliffhanger?
I wouldn't quite call it a cliffhanger, but it does leave a thread dangling, which will be picked up in a later story. I've got, let's say, 2 more stories in this arc, and that will kind of bookend the initial start of the story. I think there's going to be about 15 of these all told.
Oh, nice. That's a good little collection.
The last 2 were about 5,000 words each. This one turned out to be 20,000 words, which I didn't realize until we went to editing.
Wonderful. And the important part is you said went to editing, which puts you above a lot of the other work on the Storyteller's Vault in that you do that editing pass.
I got it, man. I perform many cruelties to the common comma, and I need help.
This I fully understand. Does it take place in a contemporary world? When and what is your world of darkness kind of like?
Roundabout now in North Texas in general, and and Dallas in particular.
Is there anything particular to you about the world of darkness in Texas?
Well, you know, Texas is going through another period of kind of a lunacy at the moment, and going through the history, that's kind of been a trend. This is a group of people who thought at the very end of the Civil War it'd be a good idea to depose their leader and founder and go accomplish nothing. And that's kind of a mindset around here. We are kind of crazy, belligerent, and arrogant.
And do the mages participate in those same worldviews, or is
the mages are more arrogant?
Okay,
you know, much more arrogant.
So you've officially done a series, and I think you are now the single largest producer of Mage the Ascension fiction on the Storyteller Vault.
I like that.
I think so. If anyone knows of anyone else,
more.
please
Y'all write more too. Come on, join the party.
Now that you have your 3rd installment, is there something that you have found that has gotten easier or alternatively harder in continuing in your same universe?
I think the hardest thing is remembering that not everybody knows many books worth of jargon and lexicon. My editor is, even though I'm in the middle of having Etherites talk science, he's telling me kind of wind back on the jargon just a bit.
Do you include like a glossary for mage terms, or is that something you just kind of include as you go through?
Not for terms, but I should mention that every one of these stories I'm putting out does have an effects and wonders list at the back. It's very light on crunch, but I do tell you what spheres I use to do the stuff.
Oh, neat. Awesome.
I think that's important.
And you've been releasing these at a steady clip. If listeners get Cyberfunk and they enjoy it, when do you think roughly the next installment may be out there?
2 or 3 months. That seems to be about my turnover. I've got a small child and all kinds of crazy stuff going on in my life, so I can't promise a consistent rate, but about 2 or 3 months.
And I look forward to talking to you when that's out. Anything else? Any other projects you're working on, or any other notes you want to leave our listeners with before we call this done?
Yeah, we're putting up Fireball Run as a pay what you want, and if you guys like what you're reading here, that's the tip jar.
That makes sense. I really appreciate that. So if you've read the previous installments, maybe you got them on discount, you like what TL is doing, you want to check a couple of bucks, by all means, grab that. Links for all of that will be in the show notes. TL, thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely. You have a great night, and happy Halloween.
Thank you. My next guest is Robbie Susan, who you may know as the Hermetic Hipster. Robbie, how you doing? And did I say your name correctly?
You did say it correctly. Thank
Hooray.
you. I'm not sure I say it correctly all the time, but thank you very much for having me, Terry.
What is the Hermetic Hipster as I guess you could say, as an identity? How did you get it? Like, what was your introduction to Mage? And what does the Hermetic Hipster brand do? I know, for instance, you have a YouTube channel. You now have a Storyteller Vault book out. What's that?
The Hermetic Hipster started as just a kind of, it's a jokey pseudonym on the back of some of my friends say that, some of my brothers say that I'm a hipster. And originally, I knew I wanted to do something lore-y for World of Darkness. I made the Hermetic Lore Master, as it was the original name. And then I was like, no, I'll be the Hermetic Hipster. And I think kind of through that, and I expressed that in the original, in kind of like the beginning and the end of my new book, he's kind of become a mage version of me, kind of a very exaggerated. That's where the energy drinks and stuff come from. It's a silly brand with a silly name. Brand's a very strong word.
So how did you discover Mage the Ascension?
I originally discovered Mage the Ascension relatively recently. I'd say about 5 years ago. I think I took a very similar trajectory to many people, which was someone got me into Vampire. Someone actually invited me to play a game called Vampire the Masquerade. And I said, no, that sounds really lame. And then they said, it's set in medieval times, and I'm a historian, I work in a museum. And I was like, okay, totally changed my mind. And I got really obsessively into Vampire. And then kind of over the years, I learned about the rest of the World of Darkness. And Mage was one that I never wanted to play. I found it really unappealing. And looking back at that, that was because I think a lot of the people who were trying to sell me on Mage were selling me on, you can do anything. There's a character called Porthos who can move planets around. And I didn't care about that. I've never played a character above, I would say, 3 with any real interest. I once played one at 4 and I didn't find it that fun. I kind of much prefer lower level games. So people telling me that Mage was this game where you could do anything, I just didn't really understand the point of it. And then a friend got me into it and I was like super hooked. At the time I was Werewolf and I was playing Mage, and Mage very quickly took my attention. And I think a lot, although I've played it quite a lot by now, a lot of my Mage time has been sitting in a pub talking about Mage with my friends who play it rather than actually playing. And I very quickly fell in love with the game.
Nice. What is the element to it that you find most attractive? Or alternatively, when people are giving that pitch that says you can do anything, what is the sentence you wish they kind of would have added to it?
I think the thing that I find I really like about it is that it encourages creativity. And I think the time I realized that is I was making a sheet and I was kind of, I'll look up the powers, because when you're making a vampire or you're making a werewolf, there's always that temptation to look at their disciplines or their gifts and see which kind of powers you might get more dice for. And I was originally a war gamer, so there's always that kind of slightly thinking about the dice rather than the role play aspect to it. And I realized in Mage you don't do that. You never roll. Your powers are not fueled by your abilities. So I found it very fun to make a person. I wasn't making someone that used Dominate, I was making a person. I think, if someone had said to me that Mage is a game about ideas fundamentally, and it's your ideas and kind of broader cultural ideas in kind of metaphysical conflict with one another, in which your character is the vessel for that, kind of obviously like modernity versus tradition, or technology versus kind of the idea of magic, and all that stuff. I think that's fascinating, really fascinating. I think out of all the games of the World of Darkness, it's the most literal representation of the real world to me. It's mage characters are characters, but they're also embodiments of real world ideas and ideals and philosophies that are kind of duking it out. And then on top of that, I find Mage very fun. I think it's a very human game, which appeals to me greatly.
So you mentioned you do the Hermetic Hipster videos. What is the nature of that channel?
So it started off, and for some reason, I was terribly afraid that I'd get copyright struck if I did anything aside from a kind of fair use review video. So my original ones are book reviews, and it started with one of my favorite books in any World of Darkness, which is The Guide to the Technocracy, the first big one. And I kind of very quickly realized that, Onyx Path or White Wolf are not going to take down my channels because I'm using a piece of art on my few hundred view videos. So then I started just kind of exploring different ideas, and there's some kind of house ruley ones. There's one about entropy, which was never a sphere I was totally satisfied with the implementation of. So I kind of talk about how to use entropy, but I talk about the different books and as they came out. And then I want to do a beginner's guide to the various groups and the kind of the people that players will, the kind of characters that players will embody. So my most recent series is a guide to the traditions, which is partly what spawned the Storyteller's Vault book.
So would you say that the channel is geared towards people who are new to the line, as opposed to some of the channels which are more like, here's why page 74 of Guide to the Traditions is inconsistent with what comes later?
That was a very cruel characterization of these hypothetical people. But, yeah. No, I definitely try and be more beginner friendly because I remember being a beginner in Mage and finding it quite hard to really. I knew I was on the right path, but I didn't quite understand it. So I tried to kind of explain that as best I can. I think that's the best way to get into the topic. And my most viewed video by far is my how to make a Mage character, which has had I think like over 10,000 views now or something, which is a lot for me. In that, and I've had a lot of positive feedback about that, I kind of really lay out how you should build a Mage character and how the initial hurdles that you will hit, which are usually overcomplicating it, and to try and keep it very simple. So yeah, I'm definitely more beginner focused. Unlike your content, I really enjoy because I learn about things that I didn't know because it's in a book that's no longer in print and I can't get hold of.
Is that something where you're going through a series, or is it just kind of topics that strike your fancy?
No, so it was topics that struck my fancy and new books as they came out. So that's why there's one for Gods and Monsters and one for Book of the Fallen. I'm doing the traditions now, so I'm going through the traditions and the viewers suggesting, kind of doing little votes on which one comes next. And I'm just over halfway through. I just released the new one, which was the Celestial Chorus. And the one before that was in like February or January or something, so ages ago. And I'm very embarrassed about that. But most of my creative juices have been used on other things this year. But I plan on doing them much quicker and then getting around to the Union and the Disparates as quickly as possible and kind of getting those done. And I feel, if I did those and nothing else, I'd be happy that if someone wants to if someone wants to jump into Mage, they've got a load of stuff there to kind of get the initial information and get their head around it.
To that point, you said you've had other creative endeavors. One of them is the Hermetic Hipster's Guide to the 9 Mystic Traditions. What is that?
This again started from a pub chat with somebody where we were actually discussing Do. I really like Do as a rule and as a concept. I'm not super into like the kind of crazy martial art moves, but I like the idea of a tradition, that's thousands of years old, having something that's a bit more static magic and something that's outside of kind of like sphere and arete roles, which Do is. And so we were kind of talking about if other traditions had it, what would that be? And then we kind of had that conversation on and off with some ideas for a little while. And then I wanted to teach myself InDesign, which is the Adobe kind of publishing suite. And so I was like, I'll give myself a little project. And then that little project became a big project and became, the Hermetic Hipster's Guide to the Traditions. And I knew as soon as I started it, I wanted it to be a bit more than my ideas. So one of the things I'm really proud about the book is it's a lot of the content in there was created in cooperation with real Mage players and kind of members of the Mage community. So for each tradition, there's a new background, which is kind of the meat of it, and I'll talk about a little bit afterwards. And there are some merits and flaws. And then there's a story and there's a piece of artwork. And all the stories and a few of the artworks were made in cooperation with people who contacted me and said, hey, I'd really love to immortalize my character for my last campaign, or I'd love to immortalize one of my friends who ran a campaign for a very long time, and I want this to be about his favorite NPC and things like that. So we worked with them to kind of write a story about those characters, which was very fun. And was really fun for me because I got to experience other people's characters and how other people saw the game, which sometimes meant we had kind of like very action-packed characters. The one for the Society of Ether is Anti, who's essentially a kind of Victorian hit mark sent to the future. And I was like, I would never have thought of that character. So we wrote a little bit about that. And then the Verbena one is essentially just a story of a Verbena mage in a city making a roof garden and kind of turning an urban kind of grubby space into essentially kind of like a natural space. So I really enjoyed that process, and meeting people and talking about them, their characters, and that was a big highlight for me of the book. That's the thing I think I'm kind of most proud of.
Who would you say that this project is targeted at?
I would say that this book is targeted at people who at least know a bit about what the traditions are. I very much didn't want to have kind of paragraphs explaining who the traditions are, because there are books for that. Anyone who's into Mage, if they want to learn about the very basics about the traditions, they can go watch my videos, or they can, read any of the core books. And I didn't want to repeat that. It's for players. I don't have a whole kind of like, there's not much expedition, there's not much kind of setting stuff, there's no NPCs. It's for players to give them something to have on their character sheets, because although I think Mage is its absolute strength is its creativity and the way you kind of craft your own set of powers and your own paradigm. Bokai, I think for me, again going back to Do, that's something very tangible that players can latch onto, is, oh, my character has this power. And so I wanted to create a set of powers that were unique to the traditions. And the way that has manifested is that they're mostly backgrounds, basically. I think a few of them are specialized knowledges. Some of them are kind of almost like magical powers. Like the Dream Speakers have one called Spirit Favor, which is essentially a kind of codified way. It's kind of like your reputation among spirits, and it's a more codified way of having that, and it's a little more complex. The Verbena one is Heirs of the Wick, or there's a suggestion for other culturally appropriate ideas if you're not playing a kind of Northern European Verbena, which is all about them engaging with the natural world and kind of drawing quintessence from it, as you might have known, in a kind of more passive way. Some of them are not like that. For example, the Hermetic one is all about your standing within the Order of Hermes and what that means. And it's kind of like, it kind of gives the ability to pull rank on other Hermetics much more easily, and it kind of replaces status, and it acts slightly like requisitions for the Union, where you can essentially kind of like have temporary background dots, basically, that the Order of Hermes will give you if you have high enough rank and high enough standing within the Order. There's a variety of them like that. I hope each one of them embodies a play style of the various traditions and kind of encourages people to think slightly differently about them. One of the things that I thought very quickly was all of these are like only one way to play a tradition. And so what I did is, I knew I wanted to have some merits and flaws. So each tradition has a single merit and a single flaw which alter those backgrounds and make them play slightly differently. For example, the Heirs of the Wick, there's a merit for the Verbena called City Slicker, which flips it. So you're kind of an urban mage, and instead of having an affinity to the natural world, you have an affinity to an urban environment. So there's kind of lots of different ways to play around with that.
Do you have a favorite piece of art? I do, and I'm just curious what yours was.
So some of the art in the book, my favorite is the cover, and there's a very personal reason for that. A lot of the art in the book was some of it was specially commissioned, some of it was very nicely donated by players who had a character commissioned and then said, oh, you can use this, and kind of like got the artist to agree with that. Some of it is the kind of stock World of Darkness stuff, and some of it is simply kind of royalty-free art that I found and I really, really loved. Which one's your favorite? Tell me first, and I'll identify it.
The punchy celestial the punchy chorister.
That's a pretty great one, isn't it? Yeah, I really like
Father Beatdown is how they would be addressed in my chronicle, were they to appear.
I really like that. It's part of an art piece of artwork that is on the Storyteller's Vault. I think it's in one of the World of Darkness packs, and I was like, yes, I'm having that. So I cut it out and put it on there. My favorite piece of artwork is the cover, and the reason for that is one of the people who very kindly sponsored my book is a very close friend of mine. That is mine and her characters, and it's my first Mage character. So we kind of commissioned this double piece that I knew we'd use for the cover and kind of split the difference. Her character, Arva Lindgren, and mine, Nausicaa Alexios, who are both members of the Order of Hermes, but both very different kinds of mages. For me, it embodies what I love about Mage, which is as their powers grew, they grew. You know, their enlightenment wasn't just their magical abilities, it was their own kind of like them getting rid of their own hangovers and chips on their shoulder and kind of seeing the world in a broader, more enlightened way, which was very, very fun. So that's a very special piece of art to me, and a big shout out to Saskia for helping me make that come to life.
And links to this, as well as to your YouTube channel, will be in the show notes. Do you have any other Storyteller Vault projects that you think that you would do, were you to have the time, let's say, not necessarily even that are on the horizon?
My dream would be to do a very similar guide to the Disparate Alliance, but I think you'd have to do a more collaborative project. Because of the various cultures represented, I just don't think it can come from one person, and you'd have to have kind of different voices telling that story. So a Union one would be very fun. I'm actually a huge Union geek. I love them, the Syndicate for life. But for now, I do have another one that I'm about halfway through, which will be very different, which is in some of our games, we played a very fun house rule called Flair, which was all about, the kind of abilities enhancing magic, kind of roll some of your objects in a practice and it can lower the difficulty. We were kind of inspired by, you ever play Changeling 20th Anniversary? So in that, there's a very, very fun rule called bunks, which is where you can essentially do something crazy that kind of like brings a bit more magic into the world, and your abilities become easier to do. So I've written a set of rules that we used in a game, and they were very fun, called Flair, where essentially if you overindulge and kind of really get into your practice and foci, you can make your magic a bit easier, basically. And so it's a very simple house rule that'll, I think I'm going to put it out for kind of 99 cents or something. That seems to be what other people are doing. That'll be a fun house rule that, again, I think rewards you for overindulging and really kind of getting your teeth into your how your mage does magic. Sometimes I feel like kind of applying practice can be a bit of a box ticky exercise, whereas I think there's a lot of fun to be had by really going all out with your foci.
I am very curious to see if that is a space that gets filled in. The 99 cent, $1.99, $1.49, whatever publication that is one very enumerated house rule or one thoroughly described interesting location or something like that. So
originally, I wasn't really too sure about it, but Charles, who I'm sure you know, gave me some really good advice, and he's one of the other kind of very prolific Storytellers Vault publishers, and he has some kind of like little rulesy things out that are much cheaper. So I thought I'd lend my hand to that and see if people are remotely interested in just kind of like, I guess, like fun ideas rather than big projects.
Well, Robbie, it's been lovely talking to you. I look forward to seeing your channel grow and any other publications come out. If we want to know what you're up to, what's the best way to do that?
So if you Google Mage the Ascension on YouTube, I'll pop up. But if you more directly Google the Hermetic Hipster, then you'll be able to find the videos. You can have a look through there. Otherwise, on Storytellers Vault, community content for Mage the Ascension, you can find my book, The Hermetic Hipster's Guide to the Traditions. I think while I'm here, I'm sure our audiences have at least a little overlap. Just a huge thank you to everyone who's supported it, and I really hope to contribute to the world of Mage in my own small way.
And thank you for probably being the on-ramp for people who are like, hey, this character creation thing is interesting. I want 300 hours of additional audio by two nitpicky people. So thank you for that work.
Exactly.
Robbie, thanks for joining.
Thank you for having me very much. I really appreciate that, Terry.
This has been Mage the Podcast, who totally thinks you should put your idea on the Storyteller Vault so I can interview you about it. No, please, do it, and then tell me. Our show is made possible by our executive producers, and those supporters are Alex, Anon, Anders S., Andrew E., Andy, Berto, Boo, Boogers to the Six, Brad of the Blue, Bryce Perry, Christopher Zach, Dan Svensson, Dennis Osborne, Freddie, Gargle Noir, Guy Conan Stewart, Isabel Castillo, Jason Kennedy, Jason W. Biggs, Jeff Bryn, Jenna F., John Horton, John Magnuson, Josh Golden, Josh Hillerup, Josh Heath, Carl Hopperin, LaBull, Leslie Weatherstone, Michael Creedle, Michael Parker, Nibero, Neil Patterson, Nikita Klaymanov, Oliver Schindler, Patrick Mulder, Ralph Scheinhammer, Richard Bat Brewster, Ryan Hilton, Ryan Kendi, Sam Tobin, Stephen Carton, St. Birdie, Thrice Great, William Connolly, William Martin, and W. Starter. Special thanks to our Oracle members, Jay Widener, Oracle of STV supplements that go impressively deep on something we never knew we wanted, Christopher Phillips, Oracle of going impressively deep on something we definitely wanted, and Buck Farmer, Oracle of STV supplements that go impressively deep on something we certainly didn't want. Our EP shoutout is to Boogers, 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 Boogers. I thought I was going to have to talk about snot until I learned that booger is an alternative term for boogeyman or bogeyman, defined as a mythical creature designed to frighten children into good behavior. The term may come from the 19th century term for the devil of bogey, which may come from the Middle English term bougie, meaning scarecrow. It relates to bugbear from bug, meaning goblin or scarecrow, and bear, an imaginary demon in the form of a bear that ate small children. The word bugaboo, with a similar pair of meanings, may have arisen as an alternative to bugbear. Thanks for your support. If you super liked this episode or super didn't, drop us a line at magethepodcast@gmail.com or at magethepodcast on Twitter. We have a Hop in Discord community at discord.me/magethepodcast. If you like us, please give us a review on a platform you're choosing or tell a friend about it. Also, go to magethepodcast.com for show notes and all of our previous shows. Now, go change reality. Bye.